joined with Dr. John Skalko, who's worked with uh, uh, the academic field of animals for about 5 years, has worked in Costa Rica with exotic animals, and teaches at St. John's Seminary. And today we're going to discuss basically the importance of the theology and the philosophy of animals. And we're going to give particular attention to animal cognition. How do animals think? Do animals think? They cognize. What do we mean by that? How do animals apprehend things in the world? How do they experience the world? Questions related to this. But I'd like to start, Dr. Skalko, by asking you, why should a devout Christian, devout Catholic, why should they care or be invested in the theology and the philosophy of animals?
Well, for one, we're almost always surrounded by them. If you're in a rural area, it's I think, pretty evident. You just walk outside, you see a lot of birds and such, right? But in some areas of the United States, you have, well, like black bears rummaging around. You have pets, dogs. Maybe you're a cat lover. When cats are more interesting than I thought initially. But dogs are cool too. I do like dogs. So there's something we interact with a lot, like sometimes on a daily basis we have pets. So I guess there's questions about, like, what are they thinking? Do they have souls? What type of souls? And I think there's a lot of like historical confusion over the issue that I think the Catholic tradition in particular has to add to the literature on the topic. But also, well, Jesus also interacted with animals, right? And ate them, actually, like fish, for example, being one case in point. But another thing is, I think that just the beauty of animals is the number of species out there. Like, just for monkeys alone, for example, is like 200 some, over 200, maybe like 250 some in the world. So at least from like a philosophical standpoint, from various important figures in the church like Thomas Aquinas, uh, you have the infinite good, but when the infinite good God is creating, that cannot be reflected in one creature alone. So you have a whole multiplicity of species, which kind of like reflects that. Right now, of course, man is, let's say, special, made in the image and likeness. But if you really want to know, I think the beauty of the creator, it's good to see the beauty of creation and the diversity of species that are out there. I think this is a very one way, it's always indirect kind of, right? Is through, I think, the study of animals.
Yeah, well, uh, I I would include as well that you touched on this, right? That there's some confusion, right, about animals, right? We see, I think, in a heightened way in our own time, uh, a sort of sentimentalism about animals. Uh, I dare say, like a fetishism, an anthropomorphism is really the technical term for it. And so it seems people are confused also about animals, about their nature, what they're capable of,
Mm-hmm.
what's going on inside that little furry head of theirs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and uh, one would a Catholic, I think, would be inclined to see what the doctors of the church have said, right, about animals, right? But there's a kind of reluctance to do that on behalf of people that say aren't particularly religious. Why do you think that is? Why would someone associate, say, Thomas Aquinas and what he writes, or Albert the Great or whatever, with a kind of backwards thinking mentality about animals?
Um, I think, well, it's in large part due to I think Descartes, not to blame it all on him, but I think modern philosophy has changed a lot about the way we think today, and I think we don't really realize quite the influence of some of these figures, even in like people who study animal cognition or comparative psychology these days, kind of like a little bit out like outside of philosophy. Um, so I think the terminology has changed a lot over the centuries. So it's like we don't really know, I think, properly how to think about it. Um, uh, but then also, mm, uh, there hasn't really been a lot of people, I think, in the Catholic world doing much on this topic. Actually, I think it's what's very interesting. Um, and then broader Christian world, I'm not sure that there's too much, but there's like a whole, I think, rich tradition here that we have that can be tapped into, where like the accounts of animal cognition are much more complicated than I think people realize these days.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I also think we have specifically in the Catholic Church, there's been a misconstrual of the patrons that represent um, the meaning of the life of animals. You think of Saint Francis of Assisi, for example. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
who doesn't almost immediately, associate him with the a kind of feel good sentiment about
Mm-hmm.
animals? But in the life of Saint Francis, there are clear indications that Francis understood the natural justice
Mm-hmm.
directed towards animals. Like he
Mm-hmm.
curses the sow. That's
Mm-hmm.
one example. And another, when the friars bring him a rabbit that had been caught in a trap, Francis admonishes the rabbit. that, You know, uh, brother rabbit, why'd you let yourself get caught? Like this is a game. This is a game, and you're a game animal. Like don't get
Mm-hmm.
caught, right? There is a kind of realistic view of the
Mm-hmm.
natural dominion that man has over animals, right? And I think I maybe people have the suspicion that they go deep enough into the medieval perspective, they're going to see a view of nature that's common to the medieval world, that
Mm-hmm.
isn't a sentimentalism,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's still in accordance with
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, uh,
Mm-hmm.
God's sort of divine plan for creation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so
I think if I could add
yeah,
something here, I think I
sure.
guess another interesting point here is a lot of people just kind of think Darwin came down the scene and then suddenly like changed everything. And before that, everybody like thought animals were, I don't know, stupid or
Hmm.
dumb, or that like they just weren't really that interesting or insightful, or that people didn't really do any sort of serious empirical work about animals. I think it was just kind of this popular view where they're like all of a sudden here's like this giant Darwin, and maybe there's like a little mention kind of maybe about Aristotle, but then they say like, well, he's wrong or not really that interesting. And granted, I think like the amount we know about animals has like, I think increased a lot. Like I think there's more time, or at least more now, I think, known about animals, I think, any other time in history. Also, just because the fact we have now actually video footage, which is like pretty amazing,
Yeah,
almost like
right,
being there, kind of, right? And
right.
with audio to some extent, right? They didn't have this historically, so like you're relying upon um, stories or such, and then you have like some academic departments that study this like full time, right? But I think it just seems like it's kind of been um, stereotyped, I think, and ignored.
Yeah.
Uh, in part, large part, because of like this, like, well, here's Darwin, and then everything is interesting after, you know, after Darwin. Uh, but I think there is some return though. Like Peter Adamson has done some work on this issue. He had like a conference on actually animals. It was like 2 3 years ago,
Hmm.
and has a volume on animals. I actually have this one here. So animals, a history. It's like different contributors.
Yeah.
And this was Oxford University Press. It's kind of like a more general one from the history, but there's also like another one coming about animals in what is it, Greek, Latin, and Arabic philosophy in the Middle Ages, or
Mm.
medieval Greek, Latin, Arabic philosophy. So I think it's been neglected. I think kind of in the academy. Uh, Even in philosophy journals, there aren't too many,
Yeah.
man, too many of us these days. But I think it might be making a comeback.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. And I think another maybe reason as to why seems to be making a comeback is that the kind of the myth of ecological guilt that Lynn White Jr. placed on the shoulders of Christianity is has pretty much died out. There's been a lot of responses to it that I think have pretty much demolished it. Hey, Micah Keel's apocalyptic ecology pretty much places the ecological guilt on pagan iniquities, um, say
What's
prior to Christianity.
the story you're thinking of? Or what's I guess the complaint people have? I'm not familiar with some of this.
Lynn
Some
White
of that like
Jr.'s,
super pre pagan kind of. I mean Aristotle and such, but some like you have different angles than I'm familiar with, which is very interesting.
yeah. So like mass slaughtering of animals in the Colosseum, is one
Oh
example of
yeah.
that. And
Mm-hmm,
Paul's responding to that too, right?
mm-hmm,
This was the meat sacrifice to idols.
mm-hmm,
Um, uh, that's that's one, but just the kind of um, dried out, aired out kind of paganism of conquest. You think of like
mm-hmm,
Alexander and
mm-hmm,
dominion in this sense of degrading
mm-hmm,
the environment.
mm-hmm,
These are kind of some of the kind of these pagan iniquities, and um, but for Lynn White, his view of why Christianity was to blame was that he thought Christianity was on one hand the most anthropocentric um, uh, religion the world has ever known. Um, that is, it so centralizes and prioritizes the human being
mm-hmm,
over all. But then also, there's this myth of Christianity as being responsible for modern science, right?
mm-hmm,
Which like you think of like Francis Bacon and science is about in some way exploiting nature's secrets,
mm-hmm,
um, experimentation, vivisection, and whatever
mm-hmm,
follows from that.
mm-hmm,
But the responses to that, I think, have been pretty devastating. On one hand, there's this sense that all what um, exploitation or treating animals badly or degrading the environment. This is rooted more in paganism, not in the biblical
mm-hmm,
worldview.
mm-hmm,
But then also, it's funny too, like Lynn White Jr., who is the kind of paragon of Christianity that can fight against Christianity's wayward views. It's Saint Francis to him. But it's what's funny is France. What Lin White Jr. and others relied upon with that is that Francis was like a panpsychic heretic. Like his view of nature was not in conformity with the medieval understanding, right? But that's not true. So
Sounds like a
Sorrel,
Straussian reading.
yeah, 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 right.
People
But
try to do
but
this with Aquinas too sometimes, I think.
yeah, exactly. It's
Yeah.
just a fundamental misunderstanding, I think, of
Yeah.
what these doctors and what the manuals and what
Mm-hmm,
the bestiaries and so on are actually saying
mm-hmm,
about these creatures, right?
mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm,
and I think it's unfortunate, but I think that's pretty much going away now. I remember Peter Harrison, his paper critiquing dominion, because that's what this idea is. Like Christianity propagated this view of like dominion, which is like
mm-hmm,
subjugating and kind of degrading and so on. Peter Harrison, kind of his point to that was that dominion means something like Solomon's kingly order,
mm-hmm,
like or the ordering of parts and the harmony and so on,
mm-hmm,
not um, domination. You know,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
mastery is not a breaking of something. It's not breaking the integrity of something. It's at times maybe bending. You think of
mm-hmm,
like in cultivating a garden. Like sometimes you may have to the vegetative being has to bend. You
mm-hmm,
want to erect it or somehow, but you're not breaking down the integrity of it. So something
Yeah.
similar is said about human relations to animals. Uh, uh, um, Although, of course, it's a little bit different than it's different than vegetation and so on. Animals are
It's like
a little bit more
proper
complex.
ordering, right?
Yes, right.
It's like I think that um, maybe the Christian view or Catholic view is more it's about like the proper ordering of nature, right? But the question is like, what's it all for, too, right? I think
Yes,
it's maybe a challenge today is we've kind of lost it. It's more like I think one of the reigning views is more about just equality,
right. Yeah.
which I mean, some people kind of think through to some extent, right? If you're like vegetarian or vegan, right? I mean, I think there's some fundamental like problems with some of the premises, but I think there's kind of like this how would I say like bipolarism maybe in the modern world, today's world, between like it's about throughout dominion because it was abused, right? Or people that took advantage of nature and like you have like horrible cases of polluters, right? For example, right? Or people just that hunt certain birds like the passenger pigeon to extinction, right? Um, um, so dominion view is wrong. So then equality, right? I think is kind of in many ways kind of the more popular sort of view, even though most people are still meat eaters,
Right,
right? So on
right.
the one hand, it's like, well, the grocery store, you eat it, tastes good, but then the people are what I don't know, maybe I'm seeing a lot of Netflix documentaries about animals. It's like, oh, we're all just the kind of the same.
Hmm.
I think is one of the big struggles today, right? So I think that's kind of also maybe the part of the rejection of the older worldview from like the Middle Ages and so forth, right? In Christianity, that they think the dominion has to automatically be like exploitation.
Yeah, that precisely. Yeah, I think that that's exactly the view. But then also, it's kind of assisted by a bad metaphysical anthropology, right?
Mm-hmm.
Humans are just different in degree, not in kind,
Mm-hmm.
from the animals. Uh, so then enters in the importance of studying animal cognition. Because I hear it a lot, a lot of the confusion of terms, that new age superstition of thinking that this word means something other than it does with the word reason.
Mm-hmm.
Do animals reason? Well, it depends on what you mean by reason, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This is what they say. And so
Mm-hmm.
your research uh, focuses a lot on that, animal cognition, uh, which is uh, yeah, based off of Thomas's treatise. Uh, I'm thinking of one on human nature, where he's kind of distinguishing the
Yeah.
powers of imagination, but distinguishing the cogitative power from the estimative power, right? Which belongs to some kind of common nature, but there's a still an important division. So could you explain more about that? I'm reading your view of estimation in animals, just sort of like the highest cognitive power that animals have, as an apprehension of particular intention by cues under the aspect of harm or benefit to the senses. That's fascinating. Could you
Mm-hmm.
could you explain more about that?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the gems that's really been forgotten in philosophical history and in animal cognition today. Is this view of the estimative power, which is in Aquinas. I think he's ultimately getting it from Avicenna, though, because you kind of have it. It's sort of in Aristotle, but it's like not really developed, not like explicitly there. It's almost like if you reasoned through it, you would have to conclude to this sort of sense that's in animals. But I don't think it's till like perhaps in Islamic philosophy, where you have some notion of it, right? So ultimately, uh, uh, when you have animals like uh, a monkey, for example, right? It has like external senses like sight, smell, taste. It can also what feel like thermals, for example, sense of touch and so forth, right? The textures. What am I missing? Hearing, right? Uh, but these are just how would we say it? Kind of like bare sensibles. So you see like colors, and there's like the odors, right? That are smelled and the flavors, right? But those things themselves aren't. It's not the same thing as perceiving this like particular orange sort of thing as something to be eaten or that's edible. So the estimates of power in animals, right, um, is what's enabling the animal to like so to speak see inside the further in beyond sort of these bare sensibles, proper common sensibles, to see this thing as like edible or um, in some cases maybe as something to like that's actionable in some sense. Maybe to like be fled from if it's like a predator, for example, right? I think this is something that Descartes, I don't know what happened, his Jesuit education, um, maybe he just didn't learn it or he forgot or it wasn't mentioned or like when he mentions in the meditations about thinking, uh, cogitare, it's like a whole new meaning of thinking that I think was never really thought of before in history. Because he puts things in there like sensory perceptions are seeming to have sensory perceptions and imagination. So all of a sudden, it's like he's including all these things that normally belong to like the exterior senses, like sight, smell, taste, and touch, but also perhaps to an extent um, to well the interior senses, like perhaps the estimates of power, right? So if you have that account where thinking includes like everything, like when you're seeing or you're feeling a pain, um, or feeling a thermal, feeling heat, that's thinking. If you're seeming to do it on Descartes' account, so then of course it gets very confusing, I think, post Descartes, right? Where you have people like um, Hume or others or Locke, right, adopt kind of some of these things and kind of change them, right? So, like for example, for Hume, reasoning becomes just linking one idea to another. But like ideas, not necessarily in some sort of super abstract kind of sense. So if this is the case, right? And then that Darwin's reading some David Hume, maybe plagiarizing him a little bit. It's not too surprising then that you would say, well, animals think, but also in a way where they're not really significantly different than humans and human cognition, right? Um, but yeah, this would be the estimative or cogitative in humans, just like where you're perceiving like particulars or individuals, but like as actionable related to action in some sense, which is oh wait, my earpiece here popped out. You still hear me, yeah?
Yeah, yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, which is different than like speculative thought, where we can think about things in abstraction apart from any individual in front of us, and even apart from whether it's something that's actionable or not. So like we can think about papaya in general, like what's its nature, how would you define it? Apart from wondering, is it this sort of tasty thing in front of us that's sweet? Um, so on the medieval view, the there's like these particularities that are noticed, so to speak, or estimated or cognized, right? And so yeah, animals do all sorts of, I think, interesting things, um, or maybe of natural instinct, but also learning. But there's not really like speculative kind of thought, like wondering what is it to be a monkey, or what's the nature of plants or papaya. I think this is like, yeah, this is like the perhaps the most important, I think, maybe discovery in the history of animal cognition.
Hmm.
In part thanks to Islam. I mean, I don't know, maybe we're going to push back on that because there's other really cool things, but I think to explain behavior, this is, I think, one of the key points.
Yeah, I know Tho Thomas is getting a lot from both Augustine and Avicenna
Mm-hmm.
in his this work on this. I don't know much. I know a lot of the early Franciscan
Mm-hmm.
school was influenced by Avicenna, but
Mm-hmm.
there are limits to that. Like,
Mhm.
they didn't take in his necessitarianism and
Mhm.
so forth.
Mhm. Mhm.
Uh, but yeah, I know I'm all for the um some Islamic some influence of the Arab thinkers,
Mhm.
on this question. And I got to say though, I think I prefer Al Ghazali to Averroes.
Mhm. Mhm.
Uh, uh, I see a kind of split between those two in terms of
Mhm.
that. I think you find a bit in Christianity, kind of the distinction between like the Illuminationists and then those who hold to a
Mhm.
more naturalized epistemology, which
Mhm.
I think
Mhm.
is a continuing difference between,
Mhm.
say, Bonaventure and Thomas.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think that that bears a lot on this question of animals too,
Mhm.
because um, I get the sense, I think I think it's a proper sense that Bonaventure, when it comes to like animals, I think he seems to me to be more interested in the meaning, uh, 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 the truth as meaning, we might say, like what is the possibility of the the renovation of animals into a reformed
Mhm.
substance,
Mhm.
the new creation. And so it's about the consummation
Mhm.
of the world in Christ. But all
Mhm.
this, these particularities about animals, it's all very important,
Mhm.
because, well, let's say the question of nature and grace. I mean, that becomes very relevant to this, right?
Mhm.
We need to understand what animals do and what they engage in by nature,
Mhm.
right? So to have a better theory of grace
Mhm.
apply to them,
Mhm.
right? And
Mhm.
I think in this sense of animals kind of perceiving individual intentions
Mhm.
by cues or by signs, I mean that's a very harmonious view of animals by nature with respect to grace. It's like,
Mhm.
Bonaventure, when he's referring to this abstracted similitude
Mhm.
of animals, the idea is like animals in their renovation or
Mhm.
in their elevation, let's say,
Mhm.
they don't live by reason, right? But they
Mhm.
live by sense,
Mhm.
and sense in a way that is unusual. What they're discerning in sense is, for instance, the beauty of Christ in man or the goodness of God in man. And so when Bonaventure is giving this sermon, for instance, on how the animals were there at the Nativity,
Mhm.
he says they were moved. So the oxes like breathed their hot
Mhm.
breath on the Christ
Mhm.
child, and he
Mhm.
says it was as if quasi they were moved by reason, but they weren't moved by reason. They were moved by love.
Mhm.
But they're living by sense. They were able to sense
Mhm.
something
Mhm.
that they normally say
Mhm.
wouldn't sense. But this is an exemplary kind of
Mhm. Mhm.
unusual occurrence, and
Mhm.
so that provides, I think, some of the rationale too behind why we bless animals. I had a German Shepherd when I got out of the military, and he was a military working dog, and I love this dog so much. Um, I won't get another one because I don't need to. Well, the Sturzians also point out we shouldn't have animals for amusement. That
Mhm.
also accords, I think, with St. Lawrence of Brindisi's commentary on Genesis,
Mhm.
about really what the three types of terrestrial animal is.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
anyway, I had this dog, and he was a great dog, and I took him to get him blessed, and following him being blessed with holy water, there were some strange, maybe uncanny would be the word, graceful events that unfolded, and it really, really kind of shocked me.
Mhm.
Uh, and from that point on, I was sort of searching for the kind of the spiritual reading of animal.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
But that's all informed without, say, Thomas and Aristotle informing me that the
Mhm.
imagination can be false. By
Mhm.
nature, animals
Mhm.
receive it,
Mhm.
kind of receive forms in a way, apprehend them,
mhm, mhm,
I wouldn't be. I don't think I'd be at a loss to explain what is happening in the realm of grace.
mhm.
Uh, and but I'm wondering though, like even according to um, nature, as it is with animals, you point out that animals might have some apprehension of like latent things in nature. So like a dog eating a medicinal herb, and maybe he doesn't have any retention
Mhm,
of that uh, I don't want to say knowledge, but knowing about that plant, but somehow is able to kind of be cued in or be tapped into the
mhm,
benefit
mhm.
of this material thing. Uh, would it make sense to say that maybe animals have um a sort of positive estimation of latent benefits or uses of things in nature?
Yeah, I think so in some cases. I mean, so the whole question of how do we say? We have like kind of these like miraculous sorts of cases. I've thought a little bit about them, but not so much. Like it's not an area I'm like actively thinking about right now. But I think it's a huge thing for I don't know for future study, and maybe there's other people who've done more work on this than I'm aware of. I know there is some mention actually of some of these cases. Like you have what Balaam's donkey, right,
Yeah,
in
right.
the Bible, right, that speaks, right.
Hmm.
Um, and then you have cases where what the animals are like kneeling down, worshiping. I think
Sure.
in some other cases, I don't know if it's in the Bible, maybe, but maybe
And the lives of the saints, you see that. I mean, you see
yeah, yeah, something like that,
Anthony.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, blessing them is great. Maybe we should have this more often. But I think particularly in rural areas, if there's a lot of farm animals, but people have pets too, right? Maybe there should be like an annual blessing of the pets. Hoping the Franciscans do this, but I haven't heard anything about it. I think in a while, right? It was
Yeah.
kind of interesting. You think this would be a good way to, I guess, reach people also. But I think those are you have like what special kind of special ways creatures are moved by God,
Yeah.
right? In kind of these miraculous sorts of cases. So like even I mean, inanimate things, you can have them what maybe floating or such, right?
Hmm.
Human beings floating, but it's I think there's some sort of miracle or act of God in those cases. It's not like the natural, ordinary cases.
Yeah.
But oh, you're asking about the latent, um, what was it things that animals perceive? Yeah.
Yeah. So like some latent benefit. I mean, in other words, could you explain more about like how, say, I've seen dogs do this. They will start eating plants, right, to help
Mhm.
with digestion or something.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem to have come from prior experience. It's like they just kind of know. I
Hmm.
mean, clearly they can develop a sort of habit of benefiting
Hmm.
from
Hmm.
reg- uh, uh, kind of perceiving the
Hmm.
use of these plants.
Hmm.
Uh, but I've been kind of astounded. Now maybe it's some of my ignorance. I don't know the whole history of that animal, but it's like they instinctively know, right?
Hmm.
And that's always a troubling word for me. Instinctive. But yeah, could you how might animals have some uh awareness of a latent benefit in a thing? Uh, I mean, do they perceive that the plant is moving in a particular way, has a particular shape or
Hmm.
form? Could you say more about that, please?
Um, I think a lot of it depends on the species, but like you ultimately need this even in humans. So we this is one thing that is interesting too is that we share a lot with animals because we are animals. We're a species of animals, just different than the others, right? Um, but there has to be something instinctual. So like when, for example, like my sister is a wire fox terrier, right? When it rounds the corner when it was a puppy and sees a squirrel, perhaps never seen a squirrel before in its entire life, right? It just starts chasing it, right? So if there's not things that are, I don't know, hardwired, but they're hardwired to like recognize or cognize as something to like be chased, pursued, or eaten, like they would literally die. Because like a mother, mother or father can offer food, right, to like their offspring, right? Or um, if like a baby wire fox terrier could have the mother around, right? They could offer the food, but like, how do you teach
Hmm.
something if it's never been seen before? I mean, maybe it goes a little back to the Nino, but there has to be something that's just naturally cognizant.
Yeah.
Just like so too with understanding or intellection, you have to have some things that are just naturally first known. So too, there has to be things that are, I would say, naturally first cognized by the estimates of sense. So
So
like
so
things
that
that
would
are
be.
basically just like edible where there's no teaching that's required. It's like whenever a puppy's born, get milk from the mother, it just naturally recognizes the milk as food or as drink, right?
Yeah.
Or um, other cases of animals, you bring them like what, maybe a monkey, maybe uh, yeah, like a baby monkey. We had one in Costa Rica. Her name was Tammy. She was tiny. She was unfortunately got somehow got latched on the back of an ambulance bumper, and then the ambulance crew was driving away and had no idea. So they find her there later on, have no idea where like her family was or the other monkey she was with. So they brought her in, but when you're feeding her out of a bottle, right? It's not like you're like, hey, look, drink.
Yeah.
She just does this naturally, right? Um, so there's kind of, I think, very species specific things that are just naturally recognized as food or as drink or as maybe as like harmful to stay away. It's like rabbits are naturally very afraid of things, right? Like they just tense up in fear, like run away, right?
Yeah.
So I think we're just naturally estimating a lot of things as you should run away from it, which they're almost like built for this, right? The way they run, very zigzaggy type of motion, right? It's hard for like a really fast animal to make the sharp corners that they're
Yeah.
doing. Um, so there's a lot of very species specific things. Yeah, they're just very, once they see it, the estimative naturally like cognizes it as like what the appropriate response is.
Yeah.
Now, of course, there's a lot of learning and um, uh, that is required. Again, training that Albert the Great talks about. Dogs, I don't. There's for the grass case when they eat grass. I mean, Albert mentions this way back in the 13th century. The teacher of Thomas Aquinas, Albert the Great, right? Probably there's some sort of sickness, which is interestingly seems to be the same kind of explanation people have today. Uh, Maybe it like helps them digest more. Some have theorized that sometimes after they do this, they like throw up,
Mhm.
which does happen, but um, it's not maybe a one-to-one correlation. Maybe there's multiple explanations for why
Mhm.
they're eating the grass. I think in that case, uh, but that's probably something they just naturally recognize. So I think dogs just many of them when they have a bad feeling in their stomach, no one has to teach them. They just see the grass and like, ooh, this all of a sudden is tasty and something that's edible.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's okay. So that's interesting. I I want to kind of consider with you the like the given of nature.
Mm-hmm,
Um, I think there are definitely some givens. Like you kind of mentioned motion, right?
mm-hmm,
Like that's definitely a given, right?
mm-hmm,
What is by nature is something that is in motion and has an innate impulse to change,
mm-hmm,
generate, to corrupt. Like it's so in a kind of biological sense, animals have to move, right?
mm-hmm,
They just have to. That's sort of like a first principle of this being under nature. And
mm-hmm,
animals are sort of under nature in a distinct way. But then, right, it gets all sorts of interesting when we consider the the particular species that are engaged in that act. And
mm-hmm,
so when you were talking about uh, uh, that I thought of like mice,
Mhm.
mice move in a particular way, like they're kind of sneaky, and they flash. Lawrence of Brindisi in his commentary on Genesis points this out, like the different terrestrial animals, like they move different, right?
Mhm.
And so there's something about the rats. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of, well, rat or mice.
Mhm.
We had a mouse in here that I finally caught the other day. So, but I'm thinking of a mouse that moves in this kind of sneaky way along the baseboard,
Mhm.
right? But then as mice get more comfortable in their environment, I think they're also
Mhm.
by nature territorial. So they start to get a little bit more comfortable. They're not so sneaky. They kind of
Mhm.
hop around
Mhm.
and bounce around.
Mhm.
But I'm thinking of like the reason for a species moving and acting in that way as a given. And so my
Mhm.
mind goes to like the seminal reasons of things.
Mhm.
Um, like you think about it in a general sense or in a general aspect, like the animal is inclined, as you were sort of pointing out, to receive nutrition from its mother,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? It's like what accounts for that, what accounts for the maternal nature of that, the maternal movement, the movement of the offspring
Mhm.
back to the
Mhm.
mother. Like, is this something we can make sense of just by reason? It seems we need a another thing there to account for the meaning of an act like that, right?
Mhm.
Um, uh, so that's just
Yeah.
a sort of
Do you mean
consideration.
kind of like why are rats like, you know, why do they stay so close to the wall and sneak along? And then why is it the dog has eats the grass when they're sick, right? I mean, that it could have been different. You mean it's kind of the question, right? I mean, because ultimately, I think like it's just um their natures, right? Like their nature could have been different, right? Maybe it could have still been a dog. Um, I don't know. Maybe it would have been a different species if you totally change some of these activities ultimately, right? Um, uh, but then I guess you can ask about what the origin of species or like who's the author of nature or such too, right? I think some of these there's just no. You can go into like a lot of biology about it, and you can have people talk about like the chemical receptors or such, right? Um, I suppose ultimately maybe there's some mystery to it that you have to ask the creator why, right? Um, uh, or there's something in the evolutionary history, I think, in some cases too, where there could be an explanation. But I think some of that's a little hard to really tell.
Yeah, so that's maybe I think that's in part what I was getting at, but I would use another example for that than the natural activities of the animals. I
Mm-hmm.
think that that's evident in nature that a mouse moves that
Mm-hmm.
does that, that a dog does that.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there's some kind of maybe extramental thing for accounting for those natural activities.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think you'd have to look at particular examples to bring out think what I'm getting at here.
Mm-hmm.
So like for example, I was speaking with a friend of mine and we were talking about dogs and wolves, The French
Mm-hmm.
have a saying like at dusk it's hard to distinguish between a dog and a wolf.
Mm-hmm.
And you might say, oh, there are sort of evolutionary properties that they have in common, or someone could point out various reasons for it. But it's a saying that's meant to drive at um, something else. Like right, so like um, uh, the question then, kind of for thinking about this, would be like, how do you distinguish between the malicious barking of a dog and the ravenousness of a wolf? I think that's what that French saying is driving at. Like, how do you distinguish between that? I mean, if you look at the footprints of a dog and a wolf, say
Mm-hmm.
a smaller wolf and a large dog, they're very similar, right?
Mm-hmm.
The traces are
Mm-hmm.
almost or seemingly indiscernible. Um,
Mm-hmm.
well, this is, I think, where the kind of useful scholastic uh, uh, I almost want to say inventions kind of become important here. Uh, One I've been reading about lately is Richard of Middleton, who was a Franciscan, kind of came after Bonaventure, and I think he tried to develop Bonaventure's theory of universals, which this goes back to what we were talking about earlier too. What's the main difference in that common nature, humans and animals, is like humans can abstract universals from
Mhm.
even from like their particular particularly perceived intentions in nature. We can
Mhm.
abstract from that, right?
Mhm.
But anyway, Richard of Middleton, he kind of has this, I'm working on it. It's my part of my
Mhm.
research, but like a proto-conceptualist view. I don't know if that's exactly fair, but
Mhm.
it's this way of trying to posit extramental reality
Mhm.
in a not strictly nominal way, but in a way that's useful for the human mind to think about
Mhm.
nature. And
Mhm.
I think there are a lot of things this doesn't apply to, but it might be interesting to study how it might apply to animals. So go back to the dog and the wolf. I was speaking with a friend of mine, and he goes, "Oh, I can solve this problem." He's like, anything that is a friend to humanity concerning dog and wolf is a dog. Anything that's a threat to humanity or danger to humanity, not a friend, is a wolf. Well, this would account for dogs, right, right, that are malicious and they're bad and they bite. They're not really dogs. It's a wolf, right? Now, it may not work in talking about cross species
Mhm.
uh, 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 beings. But for a dog and a wolf, given their closeness ancestrally, you might be
Mhm.
able to make that kind of immaterial attribution to account for the difference in those specific cases. Now, maybe that just comes across as like a literary flourish or just some fictional being that's useful for making some meaning of it. But maybe it just happens to be the case, like in truth, perhaps.
I think it's hard to like I think really define different species of animals because like they can always missing a limb or whatever you think is distinctive. If all their fur is burned off, it's still the same species. We would say, right? So I think we usually identify them by like their properties or some conglomeration of the properties. But I think it's we have a really strict account beyond that. It's well a living sensitive substance. Um, I think it's really difficult, but I think we have like enough for the details. In most cases, we can kind of tell they're different, right? This is one thing though that is kind of interesting. Is like so all dogs are the same species, right? Even though what you have like Chihuahua, German Shepherd, right? Great Dane, Saint Bernard, really different, right? All the same species, right? So I was talking
Mhm.
about like wolf versus other domesticated dogs. I mean, I don't think we would say like friendly versus non-friendly. Um, like I think your friend was saying, but there are ways I think you can tell, probably based on footprint size, and then mm, how would we say? I think aggressive behavior has something to do with it, but it's not to say that maybe there's not ways. Some of them could be tamed. Uh, but
Yeah.
this is, I guess, one point that maybe it does relate to this too is so when I was in Costa Rica, we have all these capuchin monkeys, like a lot of them.
Yeah.
There's I don't know, 15, maybe 20, no more than 20, right? That we're working with. That many of them have been pets before, so at this animal refuge, but they all had names that had been given to them. But to me, when I'm there initially, I'm like, they're like this big, right? If they're walking with the tail maybe a little bigger, right? They're taller, such, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do you tell them all are different? Because they're moving around a lot. There's a little trick people have, which is like you look at like kind of like their face, like face
Mm.
markings, like the fur might be a little different, or
Yeah.
like their nose is a little different, kind of shape a little bit,
Yeah.
where you can kind of tell the difference. So, mm, on the wolf thing, I'm sure that there's some way more or less reliable for most cases, but I mean, to like maybe the untrained ear at night, you hear one, If you don't have
Yeah.
any more information, right, to go on, and I think it's very difficult. But I think it's just kind of like an empirical thing. I think where maybe the wolf experts have a better explanation. I guess I don't really hear dogs howl a lot though, right? Wolves seem to howl now and again, at least timber wolves or such, or I think coyotes, right? Uh,
Yeah.
but I don't know. Has the German Shepherd ever howl? That you had?
Uh, Dennis, you know, I don't recall him howling. I'm sure he did at some point. Yeah, his training though, I think that he was kept under a pretty strict regimen, so
Mhm.
he barked
Or
he
maybe if you
barked a
stepped on
lot.
his foot, so by
Yeah,
accident.
well, he had a lot of those strong guarding
Mhm.
instincts. I remember people would come over to the house
Yeah, yeah.
and he wouldn't let him in. And he was the German bloodline, so he was big. You know, he wasn't the
Mhm.
American bloodline, which is a bit smaller. He
Mhm.
was like structured and huge, you know.
Mhm.
He was he's a he was a big dog.
A real German Shepherd,
Yeah, a real one, real one.
German German. Mhm.
Yeah, well, I wonder I mean, I was thinking about this as well before our for our meeting. Like, I wonder to what extent, um, say, like metaphysical pluriformism, is also kind of contributing to a difference in view of a view that kind of sees animals through the lens of something elevated or something
Mhm.
um, renovated in some way in spirit,
Mhm.
and just a more kind of purely natural um, uh, view of animals. Like, there are a number of substantial forms, like in the human being, right? Then the the way we conceptualize animals, right, is something that pertains to the state of man in a way,
Mhm.
right? So, and that's actually the context Bonaventure kind of brings it up in. Like on one hand, we can think about animals in this sense as kind of symbolizing the unruly affections of the soul of human
Mhm.
beings, right? This is kind of
Mhm.
the classical sense of a beast, right?
Mhm.
Um, but then we can also see in animals some symbol of virtue, right?
Mhm.
To live by. And
Mhm.
so, in that sense, we think of like, Paul and Jesus warning their apostles of the ravenous wolves.
Mhm.
And then we
Mhm.
think of Bonaventure talking about the sixth time of Revelation, where there's going
Mhm.
to be ferocious barking dogs, right? And
Mhm.
not in the good sense, in the negative sense, he means it.
Mhm.
I know we can think of like the hounds of the Lord or whatever.
Mhm.
Well, and
Mhm.
that's in that way, like, how do you make the difference between the bishop who's a ravenous wolf, let's say, and the barking dogs? What are they? So we have like cynics on one hand and then corrupt bishops or something, right? How do we make sense of that? Well,
I think
we got to go
the
back to
Dominicans are
nature,
the
right?
hounds of heaven, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Towards dogs, right?
yeah, yeah,
The joke, right?
yeah, yeah.
For the
It's
preaching against heresy, right?
right, 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 right. That's of course right, and that's um, there's that positive
Mhm.
in the sense of like a gain of life, something being
Mhm.
perfected by grace.
Mhm.
And, I found this out recently, and kind of thinking more about that. I was surprised. Usually the cynics, right, which comes from the Greek word for dog, the cynics have a bad reputation. Diogenes, is
Mhm.
kind of crazy. But there were a lot of cynics that were praised because they had a kind of natural mendicancy. They were like
Mhm.
natural
Mhm.
preachers of sorts. And
Mhm.
then you think of like from that thing by nature, I mean, human nature,
Mhm.
uh, reason, it's on that kind of being perfected in, let's say, the
Mhm.
Dominicans, which
Mhm.
is also named after dog in some sense,
Mhm.
preaching
Mhm.
against the Cathars, right?
Mhm.
You get a kind of natural mendicancy at first, but then
Mhm.
you get something
Mhm.
something more later. So there are kind of negative ways of thinking about this and positive ways of
Mhm.
thinking about it. I maybe some people don't like the words negative and positive. I was
Mhm.
reading It's a Jesuit scholastic who he's like, oh, that change in corruption and generation. And I'm like, oh, okay, that helps me. I'll just use it like that.
Mhm.
Um, so I mean, what do you think about that, right? Like in the patristics, we see a lot of references to animals that are symbolic of our unruly passions and affections.
Mhm.
But then space, especially uh, at the turn of the millennium in particular, you get more of an emphasis on animals symbolizing those good things, right?
Mhm.
Now we're obedient dogs,
Mhm.
right? Obedient dogs of Christ
There's also what
versus
the image for the Eucharist, right? The bird that like gives its flesh. Is that right?
yeah, the pelican.
Yeah, right. I think it's older though, right? Like
Oh,
early, is
I
it
don't know.
early Christianity? I'm not sure exactly the
I think
origins, but I'm
Tom
sure it's at least in the Middle Ages.
I think Thomas Aquinas used it, right? That was his I think in Adoro Te Devote, Christ the Good Pelican, right? I think he used it, but I don't know where it
I think it's
originated.
earlier, but I'm not sure the exactly.
That makes
But
sense.
there's some things right that are there. So um, uh, Albert mentioned some stuff like this. Like there's like some sort of species. I don't know, some birds that like are like for life together, right? But then you have some other sorts of animals. Like he mentions one case uh, where this bird is kind of derisive, so as if it's like mocking
Hmm.
other animals, right? And it's like teasing them. Um, but yeah, I think animals can be used in, I mean, all sorts of ways, right? Like as how do we say images for like good thing, good behavior, bad behavior, right? I think is very much prominent, I think, within the tradition, right?
Yeah.
But it's often based off of uh, maybe like typical behavior of the animals, or maybe what they thought was a typical behavior, because sometimes it's
Yeah.
not actually based on reality. Like I think, particularly in the medieval bestiaries, it's more how would I say fables, perhaps stories, and not meant to be like as I think like rigorous um, empirical investigation, maybe like Albert's De Animalibus, for example. But they can be useful for like sermons and stuff, I think, right? Um,
Yeah.
but there's also this on the topic, I guess, the similarities. There's a case, interestingly, so in uh, commentaries on what like the opening of the metaphysics of Aristotle, right? There's like this discussion kind of animals all of a sudden, right? And Albert and Thomas are of the view that animals share like something in prudence, right? Which is not the same exactly as in humans, right? Because through us, it's like right reason about things to be done, right? But there is something about this in animals, right? So like snakes, for example, vipers like know when to like strike it like the exact right like time, or like when a cat's like sneaking up,
Hmm.
right? Like a leopard and such, right? Uh, but they kind of like some cognition of like this is the moment, right? Or maybe this is not the moment, right?
Yeah.
Or like the rabbit, like when it's ready to run away, because sometimes they just freeze, right? I think you don't see them. Then you get closer, and then they use the energy to run away, right? Um,
Yeah. Yeah, they it's unusual. Uh I've always found that perplexing too. It's like, well, why aren't you going now? Right? And you get
because I
closer.
think when you make a movement, often sometimes, right? That's when they're out of there, right?
Yeah.
Um, but as if it's almost like a energy saving, where maybe there's something in the evolutionary history about like these ones that survived, or I guess another topic too about the whole evolution thing, right? I think
Yeah.
it's definitely a big role to play in that, but I don't think it's everything though, I guess is the other thing. Um,
Yeah.
and I think that's where philosophy has a good role to play that. Well, yes, there is evolution, there's a lot to play, but you can't explain everything just by appealing to some adaptation or such. Because adaptations have to start with some sort of given in the first place.
Hey, I have a question. I've kind of two I think two remaining. questions I have for you. I kind of wanted to touch on superstition, but maybe not. But the first had to do with you point out, I was reading an article of yours, and you point out that rather than benefit and harm, St. Thomas in the Summa uses uses or disadvantages. Is that a way of trying to kind of disassociate animal cognition from justice?
Um, no, I think it's more was just like so. Sometimes people when they read Thomas Aquinas, they're just like very interested in the Summa Theologiae, right? Which is natural because like one of these. This is like very mature work, right? Like written towards the height of his career and such, right? And pretty developed thought. And in there, he meant sometimes mentions like things about animals, but it's like kind of what's on the interior senses, right? And it's not a lot of detail. So sometimes I think people make maybe too much out of these texts. Like I'm thinking like prima par is what like question 78. I think it's like article 4 if I remember right.
Yeah.
But then like where he mentions this stuff about the essence of power, like there's a little I think more fluidity in his terminology than I think many people at least in the like philosophy I think are maybe realize at first that yeah you like an animal can cognize some particular thing as beneficial or harmful, right? But it also can think of it as like useful, not useful. So
Hmm.
it's not just about like food and drink. Sometimes like for a monkey, it can be literally like this thing is climbable or this thing is like useful to like throw at a human because I'm mad at him.
Yeah.
Uh, or um, or like this straw is useful for fishing out ants, right? As some apes have done, or for a sloth about uh, like climbing trees or like climbing how do you say there's like a backswing some of them can do. I've seen
Yeah.
try to escape or such, right? Um, so just it's really just that there's like a little bit of fluidity, I think, in some Thomas's terminology. Not that I think he's
Yeah, I hear you.
change
I
of
hear you.
mind, so to speak. But they're like, there's a little more leeway than it's just kind of, I think, bare instinct. There's two extremes, I think. Like sometimes I think in philosophy, people like very philosophically inclined are reading Aquinas and the Summa in particular, right? Read Aquinas is just like, oh, instinct, right? As maybe some translations inappropriately do. There are cases he does mention instinct, but it's not all instinct too, I think, right? There's like learning, right? So there's like that kind of extreme, I think, part of very simplistic kind of view where animals don't really do much, which I think Thomas though knew this wasn't true because I think he's good friends with Albert, right? He's writing the De Animalibus and has all sorts of things about how smart animals really are about like using recognizing herbs as medicinal, right? Learning, um, cases of like communication, cognizing like things kind of like differently depending on the species. But I think there's the other extreme of animals are maybe just as uh, exactly intelligent as us and think exactly the same as us.
Yeah.
At least in terms of like the kinds of potencies or senses or powers that they have, right? I don't know if sorry if we got off topic. It was a question. Uh,
I think I hear what you're saying. It's just what I heard was in effect that when we read sort of philosophical texts, we just need to have a sort of a common sense appreciation of how people converse.
mhm,
I say something here, that doesn't mean I'm excluding it from other places or what have you.
mhm,
It's just,
mhm,
you know, I think I understand. But there was a question I had about relational intention. Um, there's a evolutionary biologist I read a while back, but he kind of points out that, or he thinks, it's observational, of course, but that some animals engage in social rituals.
mhm,
Uh, 'Cause I don't want to say ceremony. I say social
mhm,
ritual, but it's like it's I mean it has the how do I say it? The kind of material aspects of a religious ritual. So like
Mhm.
some birds, right? When one of their when a member of their group dies, they will
Mhm.
perform something like a funeral, bringing grass and kind of covering the animal. And that made me think of, I'm like, maybe it's appropriate to think of non-human animals, not
Mhm.
as metaphysical
Mhm.
animals as or rational animals as humans are, but
Mhm.
as religious animals. Maybe there's something to that if as long as we understand religion and in a type of way. I'm thinking more the kind of the sociological view of religion,
Mhm.
not say Cicero's view of religion, which requires
Mhm.
rationality,
Mhm.
but a kind of sociological religious animal, maybe. What do you think about that?
Um, I think Darwin mentioned some cases like this. I think in the Descent of Man, um, I think there's like a case, if I'm remembering right, where like an umbrella like is blowing in the wind, and the dog is like barking at it, right? Maybe there's like some spirit there, right? Um, I mean, I honestly I'm skeptical, I guess, on this one. Uh, I mean, I think there is something about it can be very hard, I think, to define what ritual is, even for
Yeah,
humans, right? Like you can, but like what really
right.
distinguishes it from I guess it was first off, do you want to talk about religious ritual or like just ritual in general? But then it's
Yeah.
like, well, it's like, is it a ritual that I don't know, you brush your teeth first in the
Hmm.
morning, right? And then wash your face, or if it's the other way around, right? I wouldn't say, I think most people would say it's not really religious, even though maybe it's a ritual, but then what makes it a ritual beyond that it's just repetitive? Um, so if the sense of animals, I guess, doing things repetitively, yeah, for sure, right? Um, but then for the religious aspect, I mean, like a sense of God, I think this is a big difference, honestly, between humans and animals. Is I don't think you ever really see animals apart from like special miraculous occurrences that kind of like appear exteriorly worshiping. Like, I don't think they really worship or like exactly know God. I mean, some general broad sense,
Yeah.
right? But you don't see them. I don't know. It's not like they all gather around and you see them praying,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
asking God for things, or saying prayers of praise, for example, to the Creator, right? Like humans do, right? Um, I mean, some of these cases I need to look more at honestly in detail, but I mean, if you just have someone who's close to you who dies, right? Animals have, I think, like a very rich emotional life. That Albert, I think, is definitely aware of. I think Thomas has. I'm actually doing a paper I'm giving in it, like actually a week or two on, kind of related to this
Yeah.
topic a little bit. That they have emotions, right? There's like joy, anger, sadness, love, even I think in some sense, desire. Um, that when they have someone close to them die, there is like a natural grieving process, so that maybe they would want to be close to the body, or maybe there's like a shock that's happened, right?
Yeah.
I don't know about the cases like putting grass or such on the animal, but I think a lot of this could just be explained by like the natural sadness that's there. Also, because like
Yeah.
there's some sense of how do I say benefit insofar as like the other animals when you're like it's like a social species, right? You're like helping each other out, maybe helping each other hunt, get food, and so forth, right? So when one dies, it's like the the friendship in some sense has been lost, right? I mean, maybe it's like a friendship of like use in some sense, right? But there's like a natural sadness, I think, that's there, right? Um, so even in humans, you have different levels of friendship, right? Like someone could be maybe a coworker, maybe didn't know him very well, right? Maybe you just do a new job, started for a week, but then I think there's like a natural sadness, right? Um, at least I think, I hope for most people, as a decent human being, right? Somebody you only known for 7 days died, right? And you don't really know much more about them, but animals, if there's like a long extended period, right? Um, I think there's just this natural uh, sadness, right? I guess on this, this is one case of why the capuchin monkeys are fascinating. That many species, like if you observe them long enough, honestly, like most of their behaviors won't be a surprise, right? Like maybe put them in a different context. Okay, something's really different. You're doing like some special test, right? Then is the anthropomorphizing is a question, right? Are you following Lloyd Morgan's canon and so forth? But With monkeys, there's like a lot of variety. I think more than normal, where like they'll be sitting next to each other, and then they'll be like inspecting the other person's fur to like clean it, and then they take turns. Somebody else will do the same. So that's almost like, let's say, ritual. A ritual, like, I don't know that I would say it's religious in that case, right? But they do like a lot of like grooming, and it
Hmm.
can be on areas where like maybe be harder for them to reach. But I think, um, I mean, I don't know how much of this is learned or just natural. Maybe there's some studies they've done on this, but I think it's also hard to differentiate, right? Um, uh, um, I guess it's kind of like ritualish. The other cases, yeah, I don't know. I have to see the case of the bird. I mean, I'm open to different explanations, and there's something kind of like it, but some cases it's really hard to differentiate between humans and animals because like we have reason. I think there are other cases where it's much easier, but I think the ritual is like a tough case. So, but I got to read more about it.
Uh, hmm.
So maybe participation in ritual, like there's participation in prudence, perhaps, or a
Yeah,
semblance. I think.
I mean, doesn't Thomas kind of afford us uh that mode of participation? I mean, there's a contact of reason at its lowest with imagination at its highest. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's some contact,
Mm-hmm.
something that's happening, and
Mm-hmm.
might say when when that happens, that's like I don't want to say that's the miraculous itself because it's something that
Mm-hmm.
accords with nature, but it's
Mm-hmm.
those are the moments where it those experiences say that
Mm-hmm.
we humans have of that,
Mm-hmm.
it affords some kind of staying power. Like there's something that is
Mm-hmm.
maintained. It's the part of the glory of creation, maybe
Mm-hmm.
we could
Mm-hmm.
say. But the miraculous is something more. The miraculous is like
Mm-hmm.
uh, Balaam's donkey. The
Mm-hmm.
miraculous is like the ass bowing before the Eucharist in Saint
Mm-hmm.
Anthony, proving the heretics right.
Mm-hmm.
The miraculous is like um, the Wolf of Gubbio. Uh, there's probably some embellished elements of that, but what is generally understood about that story is that the wolf acted in such an unusual manner that it was an impetus behind getting the people of Gubbio to repent of their sins, because they see it and it's so exemplary, it's so outstanding, and they go, oh, there is a God, there there
Mm-hmm.
there is something that is ordering these parts and
Mm-hmm.
fashioning things in
Mm-hmm.
wisdom and in our perception and our imagination, and
Mm-hmm.
it catches us off guard.
Mm-hmm.
And with the capuchin monkeys in particular, I've met some capuchins, and they're pretty amazing creatures, the Franciscan
You mean the
capuchins.
monkeys or the order?
No, the friars, the lesser brothers,
Yeah,
that.
interesting thing. Actually, they're named after the friars because if you look at like their
Hmm.
fur, it almost looks like they have tonsure
Yeah,
naturally. Yeah.
I also found out that the cappuccino is named after the capuchins too.
Hmm.
The drink, the coffee drink. So we got
Oh, oh, really?
monkeys and coffee. Yeah, yeah.
Is it the way they pour it when you get the little cool
No,
white part in the middle, or?
no. Apparently, it goes back to, oh, I forget which crusade. It might have been in the 1300s. But the Turkish people, they had invaded. I think it was
Mhm.
Italy. And they left a bunch of coffee behind.
Mhm.
The Turks left a bunch of coffee behind, and the coffee was too strong. So apparently, this friar, this uh, um, Capuchin. Oh, if it's the Capuchins, it must have been much later. Um, uh, when did they come about? I was thinking the 1500s, but the Capuchin was like, let's make it with milk,
Mhm.
and let's like to
Mhm.
increase the intensity of the flavor,
Mhm.
the strength of the coffee, and so
Mhm.
cappuccino.
That's
Yeah,
cool.
yeah, it is cool.
I'll
I was
drink a
surprised by that.
cappuccino when you're with the cappuccino and another cappuccino.
Dude, we should get a capuchin fryer with a cappuccino and just like capuchin
And that
monkeys on it. That
monkey,
would
yeah, yeah, exactly.
there you go. Three the kind
Three.
of vestige of the Trinity right there.
Three
Three different.
cappuccinos. Yes, Bonaventure will be really proud, right?
Yeah.
There's the three everywhere, right?
Yeah.
And
Right.
the Trinity, right?
Yep. 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 Yep.
Is it
Uh,
a vestige though, or a footprint?
yeah. Right. Right.
Hmm.
It is. Represents the direct causal dependency of creatures on God. But there are no pure vestiges, I don't think. I think maybe we could keep looking though, and that's sort of what's inspiring me to continue studying animals. So, Dr. Skalko, I appreciate you coming on and talking with me, and I hope it was in some way edifying for you, and I hope it's in some way edifying for others.